right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for coming to this talk. We're going to talk today about using virtual reality to tell stories on the web and our sort of approach to doing that, why we think it's important, and how we do it. My name is Patrick Coffey. I'm a senior JavaScript engineer at Four Kitchens.
My name is Luke Herrington. I'm also a senior JavaScript engineer at Four Kitchens. So I thought it was appropriate, given the topic of this of Yale Digital this year as storytelling, to start with a story. And the story is my first experience with VR as a 90s kid. So I'll just start on that. So as a 12-year-old, I walked aimlessly around Dave and Buster's. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the arcade. Okay, some fans. So I wandered into the back room, and I was 12 years old at the time. I saw what looked like this strange scene from the future. There were two gamers up on these like high platforms. It was kind of overly dramatic, to be honest. 4 feet off the ground. They were wearing these strange, clunky headsets, and they were kind of like spinning around recklessly, yelling and shooting with these like guns they were holding at what seemed to be the air, nothing. And it was just really fascinating to me. I'd never seen anything like it. So I was intrigued, and I was there with my cousin. So I was like, hey, you want to, it was probably like $20 knowing Dave and Buster's because they're so expensive. Anyways, off topic. You want to give it a try? And so we decided, let's give it a try. So the D&B's employee strapped on the giant headset onto my 12-year-old head. It was way too big, barely fit. And, he was kind of grumpy, and he kind of quipped like, don't actually walk, like you can't walk. This is VR. You can't actually walk around, probably for the 20th time that day. And as the game got kind of fired up and started, I just remember immediately feeling like I feel sick. These graphics are horrible. My N64 is way better. And I couldn't, there was a map involved. I couldn't find my cousin. We just kind of aimlessly wandered around this game, and then our money was gone and our time was up. And to make matters worse, I actually took a couple steps and got yelled at by the employee. So suffice to say, my VR experience was pretty horrible, and I was left wondering what all the hype was about. And similar to Franz in those early days. And I was like, if that's the future, then I'd rather stick to my N64. So here we are almost 20 years later. And VR is re-entering the public conversation. And I think it's here to stay. The technology has caught up. What was once like a low-res arcade trick is now a really viable way to create games, create content, and tell stories, and even create communities. So now, anyone with a smartphone and a little bit of web development experience can build even tools and experiences on the web. So VR used to get in the way of telling stories, I think, and now there's a chance for it to complement stories, for it to use its power for good. And I think that it's becoming a really powerful platform on which to tell stories.
Back in 2011, Wired released an article with the title, "The Art of Immersion, Why Do We Tell Stories?" And the point of this article was to demonstrate how storytelling is absolutely central to the existence of humans. They outlined that it's very common to every known culture to tell stories or to listen to stories. And that storytelling in every culture involves a symbiotic exchange between a teller and a listener. They also outlined that it is this sort of interaction is something that we all learn to negotiate in infancy when we're like babies. We learn to listen to stories and to tell them. And it really sort of outlines that stories are actually just recognizable patterns. And in those patterns, we find information, and in that information, we derive meaning. We use stories to make sense of our world and to share the understanding that we have with other people. Stories are the signal within the noise of information. So how is storytelling impacted by VR? We can talk about telling stories in VR all day, but what actually does that mean, and why is it important? Well, VR is not a silver bullet. It doesn't tell stories for you, but VR is a platform that allows us to amplify immersive interactive, and emotional sort of properties of any experience. VR allows for users to not only hear, watch, or see a story, but to actually be inside of it and to engage with it. You might say, but I've been playing 3D games on my Xbox for years. And that's kind of true, and you're sort of involved in those stories, and you can kind of play through those games. But what's actually happening is you're playing a three-dimensional game projected on a two-dimensional screen. In VR, we actually have a truly three-dimensional view into a 360-degree computer-generated world. You have this true third dimension. You can put something directly in front of you or behind you, and you can turn around and look at it, right? Now, Bethesda recently released Doom VR, Fallout VR, and Skyrim VR, and the arrival of these AAA titles is very important for VR as a technology, but Skyrim VR stuck out to me and many other people specifically, because it's just one enormous story that you play through. And there's a lot of stories, actually, in Skyrim. And I played Skyrim on a PC a whole lot when I was younger. Probably I played through the main storyline 6 or 7 times because I was kind of bored. One thing that I noticed is that I never really knew what was going on in the story. I never paid attention to it. I never knew what quests I was on. I knew my objectives. I knew what bosses I had to go and fight and what weapons I was going to get from those fights. But I really had no idea why I was there doing what I was doing. I had no idea what the story was behind it. And the reason for this is I didn't like interacting with NPCs or non-player characters in the game. It was just not an interaction that I found to be valuable. You're having this character that you're controlling that you go and you use to talk to other characters. It seemed kind of like an abstract, weird thing to me, and I really didn't enjoy it, so I kind of skipped through it. So I really had no idea what was going on. But in Skyrim VR, this changed very significantly. In Skyrim VR, I find that I often stand there and listen very intently to the NPCs as they talk to me. And interestingly, I almost always instinctively respond to the dialogue lines that they're reading out to me audibly, out loud, as though I'm talking with them in real life. These conversations become interesting and very, very important to the game. And the story that's being told in each quest becomes very interesting as you're more fully immersed in the world of Skyrim. It feels very natural, and the story is very, very engaging because you're talking with these characters. They're giving you this information that has actual meaning, and that meaning pertains to the activities that you're participating in the actual game. Even though this is the exact same story that I've played through many, many times, I have a completely new experience with this virtual reality game. It's the exact same game, but I have a whole new experience because of this new dimension and this new perspective that I have inside of the game. And I'm not actually the only one that's noticed this. A modder by the name of Qubit created a Skyrim mod or modification called Dragonborn Speaks Naturally. And this modification allows you to speak your dialogue lines out loud to the NPCs as opposed to selecting them in some sort of graphical user interface, right? And Skyrim VR came out on the 3rd of April, so not very long ago, and Dragonborn Speaks Naturally was released very shortly afterward on the 15th of April. And Steam doesn't expose how many downloads its games have to you directly. There's probably a reason for that, I don't know. But Skyrim VR consistently has between 300 and 500 daily active players. Dragonborn Speaks Naturally has thousands of downloads. I think at time of picturing the slide, it's 4,613. So it's not completely unreasonable to suspect that a large portion of the player base that's actively using this game every day is actually using this mod as well in conjunction with the game, so that they can actually more intuitively and naturally speak to these mods and go through the storyline. For me, this really hits the nail on the head. Being immersed in a truly three-dimensional, 360-degree environment greatly enhances our ability to suspend our disbeliefs about the digital content or the stories that we're perceiving. And the funny thing is, those NPCs were built in 2011. That's like decades ago in computer language and computer talk and graphics and stuff like that. These are not high-quality characters. I mean, just look at this guy. This is a king in Skyrim, by the way. This is like the character they spent the most time working through. And it looks really, really low quality. The NPCs' movements are very awkward. If you walk up to them and kind of intersect with them, they'll do this weird movement where they kind of move backwards and stare at you in the face with this like soulless sort of look. It's very, very strange. But so it's not high quality. You're not looking at these NPCs thinking, wow, that's a real person. I feel like I can have a real conversation with them and relate to them. That's not really the case. But you are standing next to them, and you are looking them in the face, and you are having a direct conversation with these characters. This allows you to sacrifice reality and logic for the sake of actually enjoying the story that you're now engaging with and you're now involved with. Like I said, of course, you're not brainwashed into thinking that Skyrim is a real world. You're not tricked. It's not an illusion. But it's just enough to suck you into the story and give you a challenging but fun adventure.
So that's a great application of how VR, when combined with gaming, can tell stories that really capture a user, a player, and get them invested emotionally in the story, and actually leads to a better gameplay experience. However, that's not gaming is not the only application of VR, right? Few of us here are looking to create VR games. I think that art is also another great application of VR. And the example that I want to talk about is a multi-sensory walk-around VR experience by Mexican filmmaker Alejandro Iñárritu. And the name of the experience was called Carne y Arena, and that means flesh and sand. In this experience, viewers are immersed in the open desert at the crossing of the U.S. and Mexico border. So, I'm going to share a little excerpt from Art News, an excerpt by Greg Allen, who was there and experienced this. So, upon entering the abandoned Baptist church, you enter a small refrigerated holding cell with metal benches affixed to a freshly poured concrete floor. You read a bilingual instruction on the wall and place your shoes and socks on in a steel cupboard. You rise when an alarm sounds and a light flashes and move through a door. Your cold feet touch sand in a square room, maybe 30 feet on each side. And it's dark and featureless except for a reddish glow on the horizon set into the far wall. You walk toward the backlit figures in the center of the room who instruct you and place a backpack on your back, a VR rig on your head, and earphones on your ears. And you're told to explore freely, but not to run, and that you'll feel a tug on top of your backpack if you get close to a wall. Upon entering the VR experience, you find yourself standing alone in a waning desert night, the horizon picked out with a dim glow. You discern a small group of anxious people that emerge from the shrubs around you and pause in front of you, women, men, a baby, and a frightened child. You can approach them and watch and listen to their experience, though they do not react to your presence. And depending on where you're looking, the approach by the encounter with the ICE agents startle you. You watch as these refugees and migrants are ordered at gunpoint to take off their shoes, and you witness their terrified interrogations and apprehension all around you until suddenly the experience is over. You're relieved of your VR rig and sent to another cell to retrieve your shoes. And you then see the faces and read the accounts of the real people who restaged their border crossing experiences for Iñárritu's production. The entire cycle takes around 15 minutes. So, this art exhibit by Iñárritu is obviously an extremely large production, right? Huge in scale, CGI artists, storyboarding, setting up, obtaining an old Baptist church that they could pour sand in and create, holding cells and things like this. This is massive in scale, right? But I think what this demonstrates is that VR can be an incredibly evocative experience for people. It can be used to build empathy. And it can be a way to put yourselves quite literally in someone else's shoes and in someone else's experience that maybe you live thousands of miles away can never experience, right? So this, while these resources aren't available to everyone interested in telling stories in VR, it's amazing to see the power of what is possible with regards to building empathy and compassion for people that aren't like you. And I think that the technology will catch up and make some of these things more possible. So really it's just a matter of combining storytelling and VR tastefully and artistically.
VR gives artists a new way to express themselves. It provides a whole new series of tools and environments by which artists can create beautiful, beautiful pieces of information, really. And one of the primary examples of this is Google Tiltbrush. I mean, if you've seen an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift or any sort of like virtual reality thing, this is the application that they will probably let you experience. This is the cornerstone app for VR right now. And we've really talked about VR stories that you can sort of play through so far, but there are applications like Google Tiltbrush that allow you to create things. And there are ways that you can tell stories with these technologies, actually in VR as opposed to with VR. VR provides new creative tools for us to design and build things in real three-dimensional spaces. People can paint three-dimensional sort of like paintings in these 3D spaces as opposed to on a 2D canvas, which presents whole new opportunities for creative and artful sort of endeavors. VR also has some very serious implications for education. You can go to new places and experience brand new environments in an incredibly relatable and very informative way. VR gives us very, very new tools to build stories in many different forms, because art is basically storytelling, and so is literature and many, many other things that we humans create. So VR is so incredible and so awesome, and you can do so many great things with it. What's missing? Why doesn't everybody in this room have a VR setup at home? That's a really good question, because despite the actual incredible nature of virtual reality, it hasn't actually exploded, if you look at the numbers. And I think part of this is because of a chicken and egg problem with VR content and consumers. People are hesitant to purchase VR gear because it's expensive, and the content that's available to them is very, very limited. Companies are hesitant to create VR content because the people are hesitant to buy VR gear. So they might create a very complex and expensive game, but then there's nobody to play it. I think Bethesda kind of adapted Fallout, Doom, and Skyrim to VR because it was kind of easy for them to do. They already had these games. They didn't really change them at all. They just put a new camera in there and a new set of UI rules. It was not a very expensive thing for them to do. So I think that may be why they were able to actually make that investment. So basically, VR is at a point where it's experiencing difficulty getting off the ground. And this is where web-based virtual reality sort of comes into play. Or you could say, enter the internet where people are. The internet is where people go to tell stories. It's where people go to read, watch, and listen to stories. You have YouTube, Netflix, all these different applications that you can use to read or watch different stories, and there are thousands of them. And WebVR brings VR as a medium to this incredible story distribution network that we've been building for decades. It's an open specification that makes it possible to experience VR just in your browser, as opposed to on a super expensive setup. And this is very, very important because it means that VR is now approachable. It's approachable for developers, it's approachable for content creators, and also for consumers. Pictured in this slide is a screenshot of an application that you probably have seen at our booth if you've stopped by, Edit VR. Luke and I have both worked on this application, and it allows you to take an equirectangular 360-degree image, which you can capture in a camera that costs under $200. You can take that photo and you can make a story with it. You can annotate that photo, you can tell a whole narrative, you can make a whole navigatable series of scenes and a cohesive experience that allows people to really understand the environment that you're photographing and the things that you're trying to annotate. Also pictured in this slide is a graphic for Supermedium, which is a virtual reality browser that allows people to sort of traverse the web and find experiences that they want to enter. So now you have something to create VR experiences on the web, and you have something by which you can find it and go and experience it. So with just a phone, these aren't telephones anymore, they do a lot more than call people, and a couple of $100 to buy a 360 camera, you can capture and tell an incredibly immersive, interactive story in VR thanks to the web. WebVR is also very powerful because it's very inexpensive. Not only are the cameras that you buy to take pictures inexpensive, but the actual equipment that you use to view it is inexpensive. WebVR works on a desktop browser. It works, I've gotten WebVR experiences working on IE Edge in my Xbox. Anything that has a browser in it that has JavaScript and WebGL can run WebVR experiences. So with a phone and a piece of cardboard with magnifying glasses kind of taped inside, you can now have a stereoscope and a screen by which you can view these experiences. And you do get that third dimension. You get that ability to see objects in their relation to you as another entity. But you're not limited to these inexpensive and lower quality experiences, because WebVR is also very, very powerful. The underlying technologies that make WebVR possible, WebGL, 3JS, and other libraries that abstract away the common problems of developing graphical applications, are comparable to things like DirectX. They're not nearly as good, but they'll get there eventually, and we're working on them. You can build and distribute fully featured VR experiences that are completely and entirely powered by WebVR, and I'll demonstrate that right now. Here's a great example. Earlier you saw an image of Tiltbrush, which is an application that Google built, and it allows people to draw in a VR space with a headset, right? Well, here's APainter. It is a free, open source, and very powerful tool that lets you do all the same things that Tiltbrush lets you do. It's a very much a counterpart, functionally and in every way. It's very powerful, because while creating things in APainter might force you to have a device that has 2 controllers and maybe 6 degrees of freedom, which means you can kind of walk around and then you'll be able to move in your VR space. APainter might require that for you to be able to create things, but for viewing and experiencing those creations, all you need is a phone, or a computer, or an Xbox, or a Raspberry Pi with a screen. It doesn't really matter. Anything that has the ability to use these underlying technologies, which are everywhere, can render these experiences. And the same is sort of true for Google Tiltbrush, because they did build out their own, guess what, WebVR application that can take Tiltbrush object models and render them in the browser. So you can do those things with Google Tiltbrush, but they had to build a separate application. It's not the same thing. And it provides a whole series of complications for developers and producers to sort of have these completely isolated systems rendering the same thing. WebVR makes virtual reality possible for everybody, not just enthusiasts like me, developers, content producers, and individual consumers. Anyone right at this moment can create and consume stories in VR powered by WebVR technologies.
We won't go do a deep dive into the technical details of how necessarily to build these WebVR experiences. But I can tell you this, that you can use the same tools that you use to build websites to build WebVR experiences, the ones that you know and love. So the experiences that we showed you earlier, the editor that we built, the Google Tiltbrush example that you just saw, were built using A-Frame, which boils down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There is 3JS that sits in there and interfaces with WebGL, but it's all running in the browser. A counterpart to A-Frame is React 360, and React 360 is kind of follows the model of React.js, the front-end UI component-based library for creating components, composing components together with certain state and properties, and using a fast rendering algorithm to repaint the screen. And this is based on React Native. So the point here is that if you know HTML and CSS, or if you know some JavaScript and some React, then you can already build custom VR experiences. I want to kind of pivot here and start talking about the human side of VR. We're talking about storytelling, right? We're here really talking about accessibility in all these sessions, talking about UX. So it really comes down to the user. Who is going to be experiencing these things? And I think that VR is at its best like any technology when it highlights our humanity, when it's used to build empathy. But it's not so simple, right? Like, like Patrick said, VR is not some silver bullet that can build empathy automatically. It's not an empathy machine. It comes down to the story you're telling, the application that you choose to build. And so much of what Professor Grodzinski spoke about earlier really resonated with me, because VR is not inherently moral. And in fact, its great power comes with a lot of responsibility. She spoke about user session recording. So imagine, this is like some kind of Black Mirror episode, right? But imagine visiting a online VR community. People that you don't necessarily have around you, but you still gain a sense of community by visiting in a virtual world. You log in, you walk over, you start talking to people, you build things together, you build art together, you experience vacations together, you go on tours together, right? Imagine user session recording in that context. The amount of manipulation that could be thrust upon these people. The implications are dire, and the responsibility is great. And so I think that, like any technology, it's amoral. It's not automatically good. And that really the storytellers, the developers, have the responsibility to choose ethics. So I'm going to, I would love to talk about that, and if anyone has any questions about that, please feel free after the session. But I'm going to move a bit to the usability side as well of VR. Because when we think about websites, we think about how does a user interact with it. And the same goes for WebVR. So a little thought experiment here. I want you to imagine a textbook that moves as you try to read it. It's nonsensical, right? It absolutely defeats the purpose of reading, and it gets in the way of learning. And so I think in this way, as we're telling stories, as we're building trainings, as we're building games, you have a responsibility to not let the medium get in the way of the message or the story. And this is, I think, important to usability of VR, is that really, more than ever in VR, the medium and the message kind of become one thing. That's why we call it VR experiences. It's not really something you visit, it's something you're in. And so the usability concerns, the ethic concerns are great in that sense. So things just need to be ethically and responsibly combined in order to have that light bulb moment where someone learns something or has an empathetic moment. So at Four Kitchens, we've been conducting VR usability testing. So the staff recruited some family and friends and that had limited or no previous experience with VR. And we wanted to have like a variety of age groups and experience levels, not just young participants. So we also wanted to make sure that certain participants wore glasses, were left-handed, and the like, came from different backgrounds. So here are, it's like these tables kind of show that the spread of the people that we had. It was a fairly small sample size, but we gained some insights. And I'm going to share just a few of those from a usability standpoint. So when you're designing WebVR stories or experiences, you can't design it in the same way as a website. A button makes less sense. A drop-down menu needs to be thoughtful. So here's some things that we learned with regards to text and icons. In the study, we found that the eye icon you might have seen at our booth, that it's very common to understand that as show me more information. So certain like items like that can be used to kind of convey information and interactivity to a user. Footprints are often as understood to be leaving or moving somewhere else. So to move to a different scene, we've often used footprints as an icon. Reading in VR is very hard, actually, due to resolution issues. Just simply, like these phones are so high resolution, but when you put them so close to your face, it actually kind of starts to diminish. So choosing the correct font and the font size naturally have a big impact. And to the point of accessibility, audio is a very important aspect of VR. I think that VR experiences, if done correctly, can actually be enjoyed by non-sighted users. If stereophonic elements are introduced, if ambient sound and even audio clips with toggling on and off or volume could be introduced. And then with regards to storytelling, the narrative that you're telling, in a head-turn VR context where you cannot walk around, the user is quite literally in the center of the experience that you're creating. So centering them in the narrative, giving them things to look at around themselves is important. And using voiceover sound to kind of direct the narrative can kind of help as well. And lastly, I want to discuss navigation. In these VR scenes that are stitched together with links, it's important to create natural flows of navigation. If you have an icon next to a door that says, let's enter this door, when you enter the door, there's a teleportation effect, essentially, that you are now in this new scene. If you have the user facing the wall when they enter the door, not facing directly out of the threshold of the door, it's going to be jarring and strange to them. And it kind of breaks the suspension of disbelief a bit. And also it's a good idea to have a home screen as a high-level way to view the experience and choose what scene you want to enter from a top-down level. And finally, the fuse-based interactions are very important because not often users in WebVR won't have a controller to use, so all they have is the direction of their headset. So a fuse-based controller is often there's like a crosshair of sorts in the center of your view, very small, that upon hovering over a button or an interaction will start a countdown and maybe an animation will start, and if you look at it for 500 milliseconds, say, it will interact with that button. Or you could look away and cancel. So why are we here talking about VR at Yale? What does this have to do with all of us here? Well, at Full Kitchens, we're a web development and design and user research company. Our mission is that we make content go. And this means that we want to build tools to publish important and meaningful content to clients in media, publishing, higher education, to anyone on any platform or device. So VR is simply another platform to which you can publish content and tell stories, and it's a powerful one at that. The implications in higher education, I think, are great in training, in teaching, and building empathy. And I mean, just from some of you folks visiting the booth, I've already seen those light bulb moments of, oh, I have an idea already of what I could do. So it almost seems to just be a matter of putting in the energy, taking the photos, telling the story. So I just wanted to say on behalf of Patrick and I that we feel very honored to be here. Thank you, Franz, for inviting us.
Yes,
thank you to Julie and all the folks who put on this conference. It's a huge honor to be here. And special thanks. Come visit us at the booth, and now we'll take some time for questions.